Bar Commissioner. I think we are ready to start.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Bongani Mwale. I'm the PCC Commissioner from Nelspruit. If you may, I represent a civic organization in the PCC. Like I was saying, I'm seated on the corridor Maputo here. We're not as advantaged as people in your cities where you have fiber running around. So as we continue, I'm going to switch off my video. I'm going to be sharing this session. I'll be joined later, I'm told, by Commissioner Brian Mtlana. The agenda is very short. It's only 2 items, but they are intense. They should take us to 12:55, which is 1 o'clock, to say I'm going to be a little bit strict with time. Of course, the presenters will have to be mindful of that. The first item is going to be rendered by Steve Nichols from the PCC Secretariat. And the second one is going to be rendered by Joanna, which is she's one of our commissioners, but she's going to be wearing a different cap today. It's written on the agenda that I'm the chairperson of the Tibet College of Hersiband, and yes, I am, but I'm a commissioner today. I'm wearing other government caps, of course. Just to take you through, or as part of my opening remarks, is that we've been mandated by the president to consult and provide recommendations on the just energy transition investment plan and the country electricity planning. We have consulted with a number of stakeholders. Today we are consulting with local government. The aim of these consultations, of course, is to provide inputs into the just energy transition IP. With regards to the recommendation on the energy planning, it will be great if we'll get inputs on the recommendations in the short term, but also in the long term. And today we are going to confine ourselves within the local government capacity space. According to our agenda, or not our agenda, our calendar, we're going to be having some follow-up session this month, which are going to precede the national colloquium on the 29th of March. We planned to provide a final report, or to develop a final report by the 30th or by the end of this month, which must be presented to the president if God allows next month. Thus far, yesterday we were consulting with civil society, as you may know, some of you, and on the next week we are going to be consulting with the faith-based community, and on the 13th we're going back to consult with organized labor. On the 22nd, we're going to be consulting with government. There are a number of consultations that are still going to happen to address these 2 agenda items. But I'm not going to be long, and I'm not going to provide inputs because I will be directing the meeting. I want the presenters to be the ones that takes us to the core of the business and what we must do today. And Brian, if he's there, is going to facilitate the discussions in plenary for both items, and then I will come back later with my closing remarks and recommendations. I want to thank the Secretariat for the good work they've done, and the commissioners that have been joining these consultation sessions as well. as, of course, the most important people that we're consulting today, which is the local government sphere, as it were. I really appreciate from my end the work that we've done thus far from the Secretariat. I know the program is intense and it's not easy because every day we have to consult a stakeholder. Yeah, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure whether Steve is now ready with his presentation. Steve Nichols, I want to give you, because I do not want to be long, but I want you to confine yourself within the given time frames as well. Thank you.
Yeah, will do. Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining. I just want to recognize the MMCs and councillors that have joined us. We're really grateful for your time, and to say that this is the first session out of 2 sessions. We'll have another session in 2 weeks, and they're meant to work in tandem. So this is much more an information session, giving you a sense of what we've been working on and what our current thinking is. And then the second session will be a more formal feedback and consultation session. But of course, we're very happy to take any feedback that you might have today as well. So just some quick background. In the February 22 Commissioner Strategy session, the commissioners requested that the Secretariat look into the electricity system and how we might take into account a climate constraint when thinking about electricity planning in South Africa. So we will look at more broad questions of energy in the second half of the year, but in the first half of the year, we've focused on electricity, and this presentation is really focused on our electricity work. And this to support the commissioners in making presentations to the President and Cabinet, which, as Commissioner Mwale said, will hopefully happen in around April. So this slide presentation is really just a very high-level summary. It's a shortened version of what was sent to you in the pre-reading material, but really just to kind of give you the highlights and sort of the key areas we'd like your input on. So the conclusions and the structure of what we've done here come from a whole series of research that we've commissioned and research we've done ourselves, as well as a series of multi-stakeholder events that we held at the end of last year, looking at key aspects of energy planning. And we had some speakers from local government at several of the events, given how important a role you play in the electricity system in South Africa. So this very much preliminary conclusions we're offering for discussion, and we hope to get some strong feedback from you today and in a few weeks' time, such that the final report is more robust. So the first thing to deal with really is a lot of feedback we've received is you need a very robust means of comparing electricity systems, particularly as there's still a lot of debate in South Africa around the role of traditional baseload systems and the transition to more inverter-based renewable energy variable systems. And so this is a framework that has been recommended and is sort of internationally respected. It's called the Energy Trilemma, and it was put out by the World Energy Council. And the Energy Trilemma says that energy systems and electricity systems have to provide for 3 things simultaneously. The first, environmental sustainability, is related to things around climate change, water, and health. Energy equity is around access and affordability and fair distribution of benefits and costs. And energy security is around reliability and stability. And so any system has to meet all 3 of these. And of course, in South Africa, we think around the just transition. And so we would situate this energy trilemma within a broader spectrum on just transition that includes considerations of jobs and poverty and inequality. Fortunately, there are a lot of reports and studies that we can draw on, both locally and internationally, that have considered these energy trilemma points and are a key part in influencing how we think around energy planning. Some of these studies have been done by the likes of the World Energy Council, the International Energy Agency, the World Bank have done some work, CSIR have done a lot of work, which Meridian have used in their analysis. And then, of course, there's the work done by the National Business Initiative. So there's a range of studies that we can draw on. And really, they all say very similar things, that even without a climate constraint, even if we think about least cost energy options, and the least cost option is renewables, battery storage, and peaking support. And that peaking support is typically provided by gas. So even if we don't think about climate change, the option that gives the cheapest electricity to consumers is a renewables dominated battery storage system. So looking across all of those studies, we see some common things. All of them recommend a massive urgent investment in renewable energy. All recommend, particularly in South Africa's context, an urgent investment in the grid. And I know this is something that local government is acutely aware of. So in the grid, we think about both transmission and distribution. None of the studies recommend coal or nuclear, although those options exist in the model, they're not really being selected because they're not part of an optimal least cost solution. All of them have a need for peaking support. So as a system moves to more variable renewable energy base, there's a little bit more intermittency in the system, and you need some additional support for peaking so that you can meet peak demand, particularly if the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. All of the models have a big investment in storage. They all acknowledge other things around variable systems. You need to manage inertia and frequency in the grid, and there are other technologies that therefore need to be installed to manage that. And all of them talk about energy efficiency, again, something I imagine very important to local government. And I think this is probably a very neglected conversation in South Africa. So many of the models have energy efficiency targets in line with the National Energy Efficiency Strategy, which can be sort of up to 40% for particular industries. And so these are big goals that we need to set for ourselves and need to get going on implementation. So that's what a least cost solution would look like across all of the models. Cost is driven by the rate at which you close coal and the rate at which you install renewables. So commonly we think about this as a sort of a carbon budget. If you have a very broad encompassing carbon budget, you would probably just stick to a least cost solution. But if you have a tighter carbon budget, then you might install renewables and batteries earlier, which is slightly more expensive because you're doing it quicker. And then you would close coal at a sort of national level quicker. So that's what would happen when you apply a carbon budget. We should also be conscious that when we're using these models, there's a certain amount of uncertainty, particularly as you go out towards 2050, further away from today. And so there are some things that might change over time, that might change the kinds of solutions that we could come to. And so we've identified a couple of watch technologies that we need to pay attention to. Typically small scale nuclear, small modular reactors is one technology that could be a game changer, or carbon capture and storage. Although in both cases, these are not technologies that are particularly mature yet, and they're certainly not yet cost effective. And so they wouldn't impact the kinds of decisions we make between now and 2030. But as I say, if they became markedly cheaper, they might be something that we could use towards the 2040s. I should say, though, that carbon capture and storage is unlikely to play a big role in coal-fired power, because what it does is it increases the cost of producing electricity from those plants, and they're already not competitive with renewable energy today. So carbon capture and storage is probably only really play a big role in heavy industry where you have high quality carbon streams. So we think about these systems across that energy trilemma again, the sort of more modern variable renewable energy systems versus the more traditional systems. We see that the variable renewable energy systems tend to perform better when we consider climate change, water and air quality and health, for obvious reasons. and so, so they perform better in environmental sustainability. We also think that they are better on an energy equity consideration, because they are more affordable, so they're cheaper generally, that the models are showing, and so today's market prices. They're also more distributional, so you're able to put them on rooftops, you're able to use microgrids, you're able to use smaller distributed and embedded solar and wind, and so better for access as well, although of course you will still get access from traditional systems, but these we think are more competitive. On the security side, as you know, the big debate is around the security of renewable energy compared to traditional systems. Both of them provide security, and the research that we've done and what we see in utility choices around the world is that variable systems are also provide decent energy security. Although it should be said that you would implement them in different ways. You have to worry about different things depending on the system that you're in. Interestingly, many of the sort of metros that we've spoken to also are developing systems, and their least cost options are also renewables based, with some battery storage and potentially some peaking for gas. So that's kind of the long-term picture of how we would develop energy systems. But as you know, we are in a serious energy crisis. And so we would need to consider short-term solutions and consider whether the short-term solutions might be different. But actually, from our research, short-term solutions are the same, also variable renewable energy driven with battery storage and peaking support. And as I said, many of the municipalities we've spoken to are thinking along similar lines, but it would be interesting to hear from you all today. And there are a couple of reasons why these short-term solutions would be that way. First of all, they're cheaper, so that's important. They're able to give more access in more hard-to-reach communities, but also they can be built much more quickly. So you can get these plants online in sort of 18 to 24 months, whereas some of the other options take far longer to develop. And so just from a pragmatic point of view, this is something that we can get onto the grid quickly and that can help solve the short-term energy crisis. And of course, we see governments already moving in the right direction with many of the incentives that have been announced in the recent budget speech. So the other key component around any short-term solution is that South Africa's energy is grid constrained. And so while we have these very good locations for solar power in the Northern Cape, there's very little grid access. So you could build the power, but you couldn't get it to any consumers because the infrastructure doesn't really exist. And so a key priority is to upgrade that long-term infrastructure, which obviously will take time.
Steve?
Hello?
Sorry, Steve, I see there's a hand. I see there's a hand from... sorry to interject, my brother, from Leah.
No problem.
Leah, is there anything urgent? Do you want to post there on the chat?
Or in the
Leah, that is a mistake. I don't want us to continue and there's a technical glitch from someone and they cannot hear us.
I see.
Yeah. All right,
maybe
okay.
I
will take it as a mistake. And colleagues, if there's anything I do not want to interrupt my speakers, just post for us on the chat box. We're going to attend to any matter. Steve, apologies, my brother. Can you continue now?
Thank you. No, that's important. I would just say also, maybe if you can post questions in the Q&A function within Zoom, then it's easier for us to keep track of them. But we'll also monitor the chat. Yeah, so I was saying, obviously, long-term investment in the grid is really important because otherwise we'll find ourselves in a similar problem that we have today in 10 years' time. But there's also a short-term consideration that we have to think about in the grid. And so one of the recommendations that we are considering making is to focus our short-term energy development much more spatially. So identify where there is access to the grid. And so obviously there's places in Mpumalanga and Gauteng and other regions that there is access to the grid, and focus our procurement and development on those areas. There would need to be some short-term investment in the grid to maximize those connections. And then that way we could get power onto the grid much more quickly and in a much more known way. And we think this has two advantages. One, we're able to be much more geographic in our focus. So we know where certain materials would be needed. We know where jobs would be created. We know where skills would need to be created. But we also know, for example, what roads would need to be upgraded and what ports would be used to access some of the materials. And so we can have a much more direct plan, and can also therefore have a much more transparent plan, which we think is important in encouraging hope in people, so that they can see that there's a plan, we can monitor against that plan, and we have very clear timelines on how that would impact load shedding. So, you know, it deals with the constraints of grid access, as well as providing some really strong communication and governance basing. There are a couple of other things that you would do when you think about a spatial grid. So, for example, co-locating generation and storage. So renewables and batteries in a particular area would allow you to spread out supply into the system. And in the case of cities and municipalities, co-locating the batteries on the city side of the grid also enables distribution of demand. And so you can also then start to take advantage of some of the sort of grid modernization trends we see globally. So that's one of the key recommendations. We think that is important. It will obviously require some governance change to make happen, and we would be interested to understand some of the perspectives of municipalities in this case. But one of the areas that's come up quite frequently is being much more transparent about the queuing system for grid connections. So we know who has licenses and who's in what stage of development. Of course, in South Africa, the just transition is central and presents a challenge for us in the report, in that there's so much that needs to be done on the just transition side. What really do we focus on? And so we've identified a range of kind of short-term and long-term just transition steps that need to be taken. And so obviously providing opportunities and training for youth would be something we would need to do in the short term, and the reskilling and retraining that comes with those kinds of developments. As well as some kind of support for local businesses, particularly SMMEs and households that are impacted detrimentally by load shedding. And in the long term, thinking about economic diversification and the job creation that would come with that. And the same applies for all of the recommendations around electricity systems. There's the excellent work being done by the NICOM team and Operation Vulindlela to get more energy onto the grid. And you know, we see a lot of recommendations broadly aggregated into improving EAF as much as possible, continuing work on just transition, getting as much new generation on the grid as possible, as well as getting private sector and public energy efficiency going, as well as generation going, and then the sort of continued setting up of a market infrastructure for energy. All of these are important. All of the just transition elements are important. They're all things that we should be supporting and driving. But in our recommendations to the president, we want to focus on a couple of core things that we think will be systemic and be able to unlock a lot of change. And so this is our sort of draft list, and we'd love to get some more thoughts from you. And I'll try to highlight where we think there's a particular impact on local government. So the first is to pick up on this recommendation I made earlier, is developing a short-term spatial plan that maximizes grid usage, talking about the transparency of that process, as well as some of the governance reform that might come with that process. And of course, there's a strong connection to distribution, so we'd be very interested in some of your thoughts on that. Some of those large-scale governance reforms would include the establishment of an independent grid operator that is responsible for energy planning, making the queuing system for grid access more transparent. Another one that has a big impact for local government is adjusting the pricing system to be more cost-reflective and unbundled. So being much more clear about what the costs are for distribution, what the costs are for transmission, what the costs are for generation, and billing accordingly. Setting up a day-ahead market would be part of that kind of market optimization of the grid. Our third recommendation is a huge drive on energy efficiency, storage, and demand side management. And obviously, there's a big role for local government in that, particularly also in putting storage on your side of the transformer, which I mentioned earlier. Investing in grid upgrades in the long term is critical, but also in the short term. So this is a very important part of the long-term system improvement. And then we have three recommendations that are broadly around just transition elements, supporting public, private, and household renewable energy generation and storage, including through tariff structures and entrenching the role of cities and local governments in general. And so that's an important area to get some thinking from your side. And obviously that will require some policy reform and some support to municipalities, both in implementation and to ensure revenue security. We're aware that could potentially create revenue challenges for the city, but also if we combine that with sort of pricing reform in general, we think that can be assuaged, but again, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then Joanne will pick up later. There's a big chunk of the grant support in the JET IP that is allocated to support of municipalities. The second just transition component is providing support for those impacted by load shedding and who cannot afford electricity. So there are kind of two components to that. One is SMME support, particularly those SMMEs that are dependent on electricity. We think of barbershops with their clippers, we think of welders, we think of spaza shops who require refrigeration. So there's a bunch of support that needs to be provided there. And then the second part of that would be the disbursement of free basic electricity. How do we support that? We're conscious that some municipalities struggle to administrate the distribution of free basic electricity, as well as improving the amount of free basic electricity. So we're aware that it's, although helpful, probably not enough for the basic needs of households at this stage. And then the final just transition recommendation is just supporting the just transition more broadly through economic diversification. So we're very conscious, particularly in Mpumalanga and those regions impacted by transitions, that if you do a one-for-one swap of jobs lost from coal and jobs created in new energy systems, you would still be left with very high levels of unemployment. So in Mpumalanga, you would still have levels of unemployment around 40% and youth unemployment around 65%. And so there needs to be more than just transition of energy. We need to be thinking about other green investment and economic diversification measures in these regions. So that, very broadly speaking, are the focused recommendations that stakeholders are suggesting to us so far, and we would love to hear more from you. I guess that's the purpose of today and next week. So thank you very much. I will stop there and hand back to you, Commissioner Mwale.
Thank you very much, and thanks for respecting my time. Steve, you're precise, straight to the point. Let me acknowledge the following participants: colleagues: Salga, the City of Joburg, City of Tshwane, New Growth Environment, City of Cape Town, City of Ruleni, Sustainable Energy Market, Urban Energy, SA Cities Network, Mogale City, LM is here, Buffalo City is here, Cape Al-Gahas, local municipalities here. We have a very good attendance. We are going from the range of 73, 74 at times, of course, 78. I think it's good, this attendance, but of concern is the absence of municipalities in Mpumalanga, especially those that are hard hit. Your governing Begi, Malahleni, Makazeni, Steve Shwete, and the likes. But we will address that issue, and I want to believe they are going to interact with this recording at a later stage. But I think it's a matter that we must raise at an appropriate level. Yeah, I want to hand over to Brian Dr. Brian, I'm not sure if you are here, and I'm going to give you, according to the program, exactly, what is this? Exactly 30 minutes, so that we can then give to Joanne to take us to the next presentation. Dr. Brian, over to you. Can you facilitate this session for me? All right, colleagues, we are going to be monitoring, before that, sorry, Brian, we are going to be monitoring the Q&A chat box. You are free to give us your email address so that if there's any further work that or further documents that we need to give to you, we may give so at a later stage. Steve is going to give you his email address, so that the email address that we use to interact with our stakeholders from the Net Zero subcommittee. And yeah, I think if we can do that, we would really appreciate. But I'll be also checking if you raise any hand. If Brian does not pick you, I'm going to help Brian. Thank you very much, Comrade Brian. And you're welcome, brother.
Thanks, Butingyabonga. And good morning to everyone that has made time to join us this morning. My name is Brian Mantlana. I work at the CSIR, and I'm one of the commissioners in the Presidential Climate Commission. I'm not going to talk long. I want to open the floor for your inputs, your questions and comments to Steve. And please raise your hand. The Secretariat and the Chair are going to assist me to pick up your hands, and I will give you space to make your input. So you may start raising your hand now. We're going to run this session until 10 o'clock. Perhaps now that there's no hand that I see yet, if I may invite, I've been reading the chats that have been coming along. If I may invite Kaboni Namasango, you want to share your questions that you have for Steve that I read in the chat session. Kaboni, yes, come.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bob Matlala. I just wanted to ask, so Mr. Steve, do you think our traditional grid needs to transition to a smart grid to ensure that more generation capacity is integrated within the grid to stabilize cleaner energy, from cleaner energy? And then the second one is also, what plans does the PCC and the PCFTT have to assist local municipalities to advance the energy distribution infrastructure so that it can meet all citizens' sustainable energy demands? Thank you.
Thanks, Sisi. I think let's take another question before we go back to Steve. I want to invite Nhlanhla Ngidi. Nhlanhla, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Brian.
I was reading your comment here. You want to put your comment or question to Steve, please?
Thanks, Brian. I think first to acknowledge and welcome Steve's presentation. My question or my comment is it's actually to caution that we have to really always make sure that the basics are covered with this just energy transition. Otherwise, the acceptance and welcoming of it might have some issues at some point if we don't cover the basics. And hence, I put that comment on the chat group that we have to make sure that we don't forget. While, of course, this support, it comes across as if it's going to be centralized, right? So when the support is centralized, it has to consider the constitutional rules on the ground, especially for municipalities. So all these solutions must not be done in isolation. I see a few solutions talking about supporting businesses, supporting customers without access to electricity. So you are already encroaching on the constitutional rules, and you have to make sure that consultation is done to the T so that you address the basics that might make the support fail. I think this is what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
Yep, no, that's clear. That's clear. Lastly, before giving the floor to Steve, just for your initial comments, Steve, Devesh Motila, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I read your comment there. You want to talk further into it, please?
Well, it's relating to the question that was already asked previously in terms of making the grid smart, but in a little bit more detail. One of the quick wins I would foresee is that municipalities, especially as well as Eskom supply areas, they need to go back to the requirement that government has already legislated of time of use billing, which is not necessarily only a technology solution, but it can drive consumer behavior to incentivize consumers to use energy when the grid has excess energy available. And that is something which municipalities have not implemented. Even in the municipality of Johannesburg, we've struggled to implement that. But in terms of also the previous speaker mentioning doing some of the basics, if you can get consumers to be incentivized by using energy when there is, well, I'll say this tongue in cheek, but when there's excess available in the grid, that incentivizing them would also assist the grid. And it's also going to assist in terms of if we put more renewable, in particular solar, onto the grid, we'd have solar generation at times when we not necessarily have peaks in terms of demands in the grid. So you need the incentives and interventions such as time of use, which municipalities have missed the deadline probably like 10 years ago. So that also relates again to making the grid smart. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for that input. Leah, at the beginning, you had your hand raised. I'm just checking with you, Leah, from the city of Cape Town. Did you want to make an input or are you covered?
Thanks, Brian. I think Steve has answered my question in the Q&A box.
Great. Okay, Steve, you want to comment on what you've heard so far? While Steve is commenting, and please also raise your hands or write comments so that we can continue the engagement. Steve?
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. And maybe just to make a point on process. So we are consulting now. So we have a general sense, I think, and it seems like this audience agrees of what needs to be done. And we're now working out the details. And so we may not have all of the details that we would like when we make recommendations to the president in April, but at least we need to be directionally correct and start to have the framework of those details. So this will be a living document, will be a living process, and as we learn, we'll be able to be much more directive about where the PCC and the JET investment plan can be supportive. On specific questions, yes, the grid needs to be made more smart for sure. It's interesting that the G20 have a parallel group called the B20. So it's sort of a big grouping of businesses. And one of the things that they raise as the biggest risks and highest priority intervention areas is the digitization of the grid in general. And so there's a smart grid necessity at a sort of local government level, but there's also a smart grid necessity at a grid balancing level and sort of providing inertia in the grid as well. So yes, upgrading to a smart grid is really important. We would need to work out the timing of that, we can probably get a long way, all the way to alleviating load shedding without having to upgrade the grid in particular. But if we're going to achieve the long-term net zero goals for the grid, then a smart grid is absolutely critical. So yeah, I appreciate that comment. In terms of the plans to assist local municipalities, this is something that's still in development. And so we, as the PCC, are engaging with local municipalities and are starting to develop methodologies in particular in support of some of the just transition elements. At the moment, most focused on economic diversification. How do we think about creating other opportunities for our community members in those local government areas? But Joanne will talk more about that from the JET IP side, and there's certainly a lot of support intended. And Tlantla, I really welcome your comments. Completely agree. There's no, it's certainly not intended for the presentation to come across as centralizing things, but merely to identify a whole range of modalities that we would need to implement. Some of them we might do centrally, but we anticipate local government playing a very important role, particularly in distribution and in the management of distributed and embedded power. The point around time of use tariffs, agreed, that's well made. And then there was a question in the chat from Lindiwe about decentralized renewable energy systems. Yeah, I think that is a very important consideration, particularly in areas where they may not have electricity access at the moment. And so we know some of the solutions that Eskom have been developing as part of their Komati repurposing project is the development of these container-based powered systems. Effectively, they're kind of mini grids with renewable capacity. And so that kind of solution, we think, has a very important role to play to reach the last sort of 10 to 15% of people who are not currently electrified. I think I covered most of the key questions there, but yeah, we welcome more questions and more input, and please do mail us. Simpiwe dropped the email address into the chat. It's mitigation@climatecommission.org.za. We would be most grateful to get your thoughts and comments. Back to you for the moment, Brian.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I noticed that you've already responded to Olga's question, so I'm going to skip that one. Chair, I'm not seeing hands, so I'm relying on what's coming from the chat. But I see now Colin has got the hand up. Colin Masego, please come in. Can you hear me, Colin?
Oh, sorry, I did not put in the mic, but mine is just a comment, especially around the distribution and management of the grid. Taking into account that a lot of our municipalities are struggling financially, I'm worried about the management of the grid, because does that say our municipalities must manage them? And if that is the case, the fact that they're not collecting enough revenue to, manage other finance, issues in our municipalities. So now, has that been taken into consideration? And what are the plans going forward to assist our municipalities, to be able to take those responsibilities? And further to that, our municipalities also the issue of capacity. Say, for example, I'm thinking about energy plans for our municipalities. The fact that they don't have capacity and they're lagging behind in terms of developing, other plans. Probably that also supports the IDP. So now, how do we start to balance those so that our municipalities are able to effectively implement what is anticipated as per the objective of the PCC? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks, Colin. Anyone else who wants to make an input?
There's Kaylin Simpson, Brian, on the chat. If you may check that and give her the feedback. She's querying something on municipal finance model in relations to their own revenue collection. Yes.
Kaylin, can you come in? And then after that, we'll have Devish.
Thank you, Chair. The recommendations made are welcomed, and especially the support for tariff restructuring. But I have a question around whether we should look to push that further, because electricity sales is the main revenue stream for most municipalities. If it should go beyond tariff reform, but to more of a corporate finance strategy type of support, where we could start to look at reasonable projections for electricity sales over time, because it's taking into account not only changes in electricity demand profiles, but it's also how Eskom is going to be structuring their charges to us over time is going to have a huge impact on what revenue we're able to recoup.
Okay, now thanks, Kaylin. Then before going to Steve, I want to give the floor to Devish. Devish, can you hear me?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make a comment as well. The model of reliance of municipalities towards the sale of electricity to sort of co-fund other programs in the city, it's an unsustainable model, in that over the last several years, there's definitely been a decline in terms of electricity revenue generation, in terms of sales, and that poses a major risk to municipalities. Even in City of Johannesburg, we've definitely seen over the years a decline in the revenue generation from the sale of electricity. And it does pose challenges with regards to other services that's delivered by the municipality, which is reliant on that revenue generation. I think in terms of the PCC, we need to highlight and stress the need for a decoupling in terms of reliance on that electricity sales. If we start to look at alternate energy mixes being integrated at various levels of the grid, we were going to find that the reliance on electricity sales is not going to be able to sustain the municipal operations. And over the years, it has been either direct or indirect, a reason why municipalities have not been moving towards adopting alternate energy supplies, in particular renewable, because there's always been a sense that if we were to go mainstream with renewable and rooftop in particular, we're going to lose revenue. The reality is that the revenues have been declining over many, many years, and they continue to decline. So it's a major risk, and I think it's an area of focus that the recommendations needs to place on other spheres of government, that we need to really look at having different models now for how we would fund operations in the municipality. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. That's very helpful. I mean, we're aware of the sort of revenue challenges within municipalities. We do hear two different sides to that story, though, Devish, and it would be great to hear your thoughts on it. One is that municipalities are earning revenue through the resale of energy, and that is declining over time, as you've described it. But the other one we hear is that some municipalities actually make a loss in distributing energy, and particularly those that don't necessarily have a wealthy population within their city. So it'll be interesting to hear from other people on the call how they find that. But generally speaking, very aware that the revenue models is a big challenge in this space. And again, would love the experts on the call's thoughts on how that might be resolved. And certainly something that we will think about carefully in the report. to Colin's point about distribution and skills capacities within in municipalities, really well heard, well made. We also have a sense that some municipalities might have skill challenges just in the administration of a slightly more complex system. So if you're taking in feed-in tariffs from solar from households, for example, that requires an administrative support that may not exist in some municipalities. And so, yeah, so hear your point. Kaylee, I would be interested in a longer conversation about your thoughts there. Again, it relates to the general revenue model and how we might think about financing, and so we can think about that some more. And then also just to acknowledge the point from Erlin in the chat about smart meter manufacturer. So we do think there are job opportunities as well in this rollout, and because the grid or the generation will be more dispersed, there'll be more opportunities for both installation and servicing, but also the manufacture of key ingredients. And I think that point around smart meter manufacturer is also a good one. Yeah, most of those were just really helpful comments, so don't have too much to respond on. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to take the two hands that I see now, and then I'm going to go back to the chair to take us to the next speaker. So I've got first Nomdeni, and then after that I've got Megan. Nomdeni. Can you hear me, Nomdeni? Okay, it looks like Nomdeni cannot speak now. Megan, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please continue.
Great. Thanks. So, Steve, I'm just taking you sort of welcomed some input on the revenue story. So I thought, let me just jump in very quickly. So, Brian, I'm from Sustainable Energy Africa, and we work very closely with SALGA, with South African Local Government Association, and are doing quite a lot of the municipal support work around leveraging of embedded generation onto the network, et cetera, et cetera. I just wanted to just make one comment on the revenue thing. So Steve, I think what's exciting about so there are two aspects. The one is the actual structure of the distribution utilities. And as the first sort of more detailed level of cost to supply studies get done and data actually comes through for the first time, I think there's going to be really interesting sort of actual empirical data on the viability of distribution utilities, because I think people know that losses are being made, but there's not actually sufficient kind of empirical understanding of where is it to do with a structural problem and where is it to do with a more political problem around revenue collection, which links into FBE and your comments about FBE. So where FBE is not being properly administered, often there's sort of non-technical losses where people simply don't pay, but it's sort of balancing off that FBE. So it will just distinguish where is there structural problems that need to be addressed, or where are they sort of issues of actual revenue collection or better administration of FBE. So that'll be really interesting, and that's work in progress. And then the thing I wanted to say is that there's this very common sort of idea that with with embedded generation and efficiency and the actual reduction of electrons on the other side of the meter, that municipalities will lose revenue. And I think it is true that as it stands now, they will lose revenue, but there are two key things to get right with the costing. So the one is to obviously to correctly cost the fixed charges, so that even if you're using embedded gen, you are still paying your fixed costs. But a lot of the municipal cross subsidy comes through the kind of surplus that's charged on the volume. And the sense there is that if municipalities start properly costing the asset base and generating their surplus off the cost of the asset base, as a business would do with sort of the weighted average cost of capital of that base, they'll actually be able to recoup a similar level of surplus than if they were doing it off the volumetric sales, and then they'd be completely neutral to the volume. So these are obviously complex discussions, but I think I'm just wanting to raise that there is, data coming through on this and some interesting thinking coming through on this. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, Denny, are you back? Can you still hear me? Devesh, I note your hand, but I'm looking at the time also. May I request that we give the floor to Steve, or perhaps, no, I'll give you the floor, Devesh. I'll give you the last minute to make your input, then go back to Steve. Please come in, Devesh.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry for taking up the floor so often. Just another thought I wanted to share as well, which is of benefit in terms of the discussions we're having. One of the biggest consumers of energy, even at the local government level, is the water sector itself. So some work I did a while back for City of Joburg was to have a focused look at the water sector in particular, and to have interventions that actually reduce the energy consumption, because for every kiloliter of water that moves in the network, you're usually using 1 kilowatt of energy, 1 kilowatt hour of energy. And interventions in that space is not necessarily always focused upon. And that's, again, internal efficiencies. And that has a huge bearing on the financial models that get used, in particular with the energy models, in that costs gets just passed on to the consumer. And of course, it's energy electrons that are wasted as well in the system. Any water leak means you're losing energy as well. So I just wanted to maybe suggest that be a focal point raised as well, that the water sector needs to have focused efforts in terms of energy efficiency. And even if you're looking at water losses, on a revenue perspective, there's a lot of efficiency losses in terms of the revenues, both on the electricity side as well as the water side. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Nomdeni is back. Nomdeni, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Nomdeni? Okay. Steve, you want to respond to the comments that have come through?
Yeah, I mean, really just to say I'm acutely aware of the expertise that sits in the sector, and really appreciate the many helpful comments today. I think both Megan and Devish's comments there, not too much for me to respond to other than that's fascinating. We would really welcome in the build up to the next session in 2 weeks' time, any submission from any of you, also referring us to studies like Megan referred to where they might be accessible. So yeah, just thanks again to everybody. That was incredibly helpful.
No, thanks, Steve. I'm heading over to you, Bongani, to take us to the next presenter, please.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. You and Steve were wonderful with time. You only child 1 minute. But thank you very much, Brian and Steve, and the speakers that contributed. We've been taking note, and I think your contributions are going to enrich our final submission to the President. Like I indicated before, you're welcome to interact with us through the provided email, or you can also talk to Steve. I want to believe, Steve, you have your own dedicated work email as well. I know you are available to talk to the communities and the stakeholders on this subject. Yeah, with that said, we're now moving to Joanne. Just to introduce Joanne. Joanne is the one of the commissioners, but as I indicated, she's wearing a different cap today. She's going to be giving us a presentation on the just energy transition IP. Joanne, the interest, if I look previously, the interest is on this agenda item. And fortunately today we have government, local government here. They're not going to be speculative and talk about issues that we do not know. We're going to confine ourselves to your presentation. We're not going to deviate to what we hear in the media, the accusations thrown around and whatnot. Thank you very much. We're not going to eat your time, but we are going to give you as much time as possible to take us through step by step, because going through the previous videos, I got the sense that people are really interested in the JET IP, as it were. Thank you very much, Joanne.
Thank you, Commissioner Mwale. Thanks for the introduction, and morning to everybody on the line, in particular to the MMCs and councillors who are on the line, as well as to, I think, as we've heard from the questions, the set of extremely informed and experts from experts and practitioners from the municipal sector. I am going to run you through both the background to and the contents of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that the President launched in November last year and then handed over to the International Partners Group at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we are now at the point of doing two things, three things actually. The first is this consultation process, in order that we enrich the investment plan with your comments, your input, your suggestions, your identification of things that might be wrong or where further work needs to be done. The second thing is that we are in the very early stages of starting to look at implementation around the plan, and I'll go into that in a fair degree of detail at the end. And the third thing is that as part of that implementation, what we need to be doing in the next short while is deciding where further work might need to be commissioned in order that we give much more substance to the proposals that have been made in the investment plan. And I think that this consultation is a particularly important one. And I think the issues that have been raised in the conversation around the PCC recommendations have already started to identify some of where we might use the opportunity of the investment plan to get some quite important work done. I just also want to say that on the line with me is Neil Cole, and Neil Cole has been part of the JET IP Secretariat and has a great experience in public sector finance. And so I'm also hoping that when it comes to questions and engagement, that Neil, if he wants to, will come onto the line and also engage with some of the issues that you raise. Okay, so I think that in doing this presentation, I'll take you through the whole JET IP story, but I do want to dwell on two sections, three sections in particular. The one is the electricity sector, including the just transition elements of it. And then secondly, to talk very specifically around the proposals that we have made around the municipal sector. Okay, so just a little bit of background. This plan comes out of the high-level political declaration that was made between South Africa and the International Partners Group, who consist of the UK, the US, the EU, France, and Germany. And it was a high-level political agreement that was made at the COP in Glasgow, and that basically opened the way for the IPG to pledge an amount of $8.5 billion to South Africa to support our ambitious NDC. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. So kind of, it's basically money or finance for climate ambition is the important framing of this program. I think importantly to say that we were first off the blocks in developing a just energy transition investment plan. And over the period since we started doing the work, there's quite a queue of other countries who are wanting to do a similar piece of work and who are similarly looking for climate finance, importantly. So that includes countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal is doing a plan, Nigeria is doing a plan, Egypt is doing a kind of similar piece of work. They aren't calling it a JET IP, but I think that we have been world leaders in putting the plan together. And the question, I suppose, is can we be world leaders in its implementation going forward? Okay, next slide. Okay, so maybe to talk about some of the kind of, I suppose, boundary conditions or things that really, the understandings that informed the development of this plan. Firstly, we took into account the serious climate risks that we face, including the physical climate impacts. And I mean, I'm certain if there's anyone here from eThekwini, it's the issues of drought, floods, fire in the Western Cape, these climate disasters that are happening much, much more frequently. Secondly, the carbon intensive nature of our economy, and South Africa is the most carbon intensive economy in the world. And that poses very specific risks to our, particularly to our exports into the future, and particularly our exports to our big trading partners, including the EU and the US. And then the risks that we face if we don't manage this transition in a way that supports affected workers, communities, and industries. And that speaks to the just transition element of this, and I'll go into detail. Then we understand that we are in the early stages of moving from a high carbon economy to net zero by 2050. We want to do this in a way that is really well managed and well structured. And in doing that, we want to address poverty, inequality, unemployment, and economic exclusion. So in other words, we want to look for what are the opportunities in this transition that will allow us to ensure that that South Africans have better opportunities. It's a whole of society transition. There is no one who's going to be unaffected by this in one way or another. And the PCC, I think, and the work that the PCC is doing really has created, firstly, a forum for engagement like we are having today, but also hopefully the ability then on the basis of that conversation to find the consensus, the alignment, the partnerships that will allow us to all move forward at once. Then in submitting our updated NDC to the UNFCCC, we really took the commitment in the convention that the developed world must support the developing world in its climate ambitions. And putting this plan on the table really is saying to the international community, you have an obligation to support us in line with the convention and the Paris Agreement. And then lastly, to talk about the timeframes, why this is a 2023 to 2027 plan. And it is because in that political declaration, the commitment was to a 5-year rolling partnership. So I think it's intended that you'll have these 5-year cycles of support from the developed world to South Africa in its decarbonization plans. And what we thought we should be doing is to start off by saying, what do we need in order to get ourselves off the blocks? And then what will put us on the trajectory that will take us forward in terms of achieving our NDC ambitions, as well as moving in the long run towards net zero. So that's why that 2023 to 2027 timeframe. Next slide. Okay. So so the plan builds a pathway towards a low carbon and climate resilient society. And really what it tries to do is to look at what would we need to do if we wanted to decarbonize the economy within the NDC target range. And that target range is, it commits South Africa to trying to reduce its emissions to within a range of 420 megatons carbon equivalent at the top and 350 at the bottom. And I think the assumption or the understanding is that we could probably get to 420 on our own as a country, but 350 is a seriously big ask, and that would require significant support from the international community. So this is a kind of contingent thing. We can't do it on our own. We took the approach that, yes, there is a financial offer of $8.5 billion on the table, but it's going to require us as a country much more to be able to do this. And so what we put on the table and what the ask is in this investment plan is to say, if we're going to do everything we want to, we're looking at an amount of around 1.5 trillion rand over the period from many sources. And then the political declaration prioritizes 3 sectors: electricity, new energy vehicles, and green hydrogen. And then in putting the plan together, what we identified is that there are 2 cross-cutting areas. And the first is around human capital development and how we as a country start to develop the skills base in order to be able to take this transition forward. And then what we identified, and it's what we're talking about today, is that municipalities have an absolutely critical and pivotal role to play in this energy transition. It will have major impacts on municipalities. It is both a major opportunity, and if we don't manage it properly, there are threats that we will need to deal with. And so it's very, very important that we look at how we ensure that there is an adequate recognition of the role that municipalities play and the kinds of investments and actions that are needed at a municipal level. Next slide. Okay, so maybe to just to talk about all the multiple things that we would want to achieve through this, the multiple positive things that we would want to achieve through this energy transition. We want to protect vulnerable workers and communities, particularly in the coal value chain, but this is a much bigger transition. So, for example, there's huge risks to workers in the transport value chain if we don't deal with the transition properly, and a set of other sectors. We want to build energy security through this process. In other words, look at how this plan can also address our immediate crises. We want to look at how we can use it to expand energy access. And I'll talk a bit later about the feedback from some of the other constituencies that we've spoken to. I think there is a concern that we use this to address energy poverty, how we use it to promote industrial development and drive innovation, to develop sustainable livelihoods and enable economic diversification, particularly in the sectors and geographies that are most affected, and then how we can use it to spur inclusive economic growth. And really that is aligned with the NDP on the one hand and with the Just Transition Framework on the other. Next slide. Can we move the slides, please? Okay, now to start talking about the money, and quite a lot of the rest of this is around the money. So this is a summary of how the $1.48 trillion ask is made up. The bulk of the finance we're looking at going into the electricity sector, and you'll see right at the bottom, it excludes the municipal capacity, where at the moment we have this very big global amount of 319 billion rand. And I'll disaggregate that later. We are looking at 128 billion rand for new energy vehicles. There's also a bit of that we think is directly relevant to municipalities. We want to get a green hydrogen sector up and running in our country, and that requires both the development of projects and the financing of them, as well as building infrastructure for them. Skills development, there is a 2.7 billion rand allocation. We have been roundly criticized by everybody for such a small amount, but I think an important part of the work going forward is to look at what does the skill system already invest in this. So in other words, what are the budgets that the SETA, that business and government contribution to the SETAs, the skills levy, the budgetary allocations to the TVET colleges and others, and how can this amount or a greater amount leverage and support the processes. Next slide. Okay, importantly, this slide, I'm not going to go through it in detail. You will get all of the slides, so you'll be able to look at it for yourself. Really tries to identify the, as of November last year, and it's important, it's as of November last year, the policy framework that applied in relation to the sectors that are covered in the JET IP. And importantly to say, we took that policy framework as read. We didn't see the document as anything that was going to make major policy proposals. So we took the IRP 2019 as a framing for the document. We looked at what the climate change bill says. We looked at where the discussion in the DTIC around new energy vehicles was as of November last year. We took the NDC as read. We took into account the DMRE's just transition framework. And so that really sets out this policy framework that we took as read. As you all know, it is a rapidly changing area. The president made announcements at the point that we were finalizing this plan in relation to embedded generation. In the period, municipalities were given the ability to sign PPAs around energy procurement, and there are more and more reforms that are happening at this point in time around energy. So it's a fast-moving policy environment, but I think important to understand that where this plan is located is where we were at in November last year. Next slide. Okay, maybe just to go on to each of the sectors in a little bit more detail. In the electricity sector, and I'm not going to read each of the amounts, but there are a package of issues, and we'll go on to the next slide as well, where we are looking at what is needed to support the decommissioning of the coal plants that are about to reach end of life. I'm sure all of you know about the Komati project, but there are 3 others that in the next 5 or 7 years reach end of life, and where there would need to be decisions taken. There's a big allocation to transmission, and I think Steve explained the issues around the transmission grid. The distribution that is referred to in here is not municipal distribution. It is the ESCOM distribution grid, what needs to be done in relation to that. And then there is a big provision for new capacity. And this is agnostic. It's not saying that it is capacity that is going to be built by ESCOM, by municipalities, by private providers, but it's saying this is what we think we will need. And then there's also a provision for battery storage. So that makes up out of that 711,647.7. Next slide. Okay, there's then another 60.4 billion, which really talks to the just transition in Mpumalanga and recognizes that over the next 10, 15, 20 years, there's going to be a fundamental shift in the economic base, particularly of the Mpumalanga Highveld, but that one's got to look at that area as a whole and look at how one can manage that transition and the implications for the coal value chain. And the activities range from repurposing coal plants and mining land to improving infrastructure for new kinds of development. If the road network, for example, in Mpumalanga has been very, very badly damaged. We've put in allocations for diversification of local economies. There is an allocation which is going to need quite a lot of work around caring for the coal workforce, which is really looking towards those people who may lose their jobs in the process of this transition, but who may not be in a position to find new economic opportunities. And we're going to have to work with the Department of Social Development and others, but we think we need to make an allocation. There's quite a lot of international experience of how in countries like Germany, Spain, Chile, actually, governments have provided for this category of people. There's allocations around looking at youth skilling and youth employability in this process. Planning for success is critical. Essentially, we're looking at a new economic base and a new and diversified economic base for Mpumalanga. And there's then looking at post-mining redevelopment and building capacity for the success. And that capacity building, I think a little bit has been referred to in the conversation earlier on about the need for capacity. I think that amount may not be adequate, and we might need to, the ask might actually be larger. So those are the just transition elements at this point in time in the coal belt. Next one. The next slide links to this, which is really around looking at the issues around the potential for localizing the clean energy value chain. We do have the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan in development that has done a very detailed analysis of where we have existing capacity and assets that would enable us to start manufacturing. And then an issue of particular importance, I think, that has come up in the engagements, in particular with labor and with civil society, is that there is a very strong demand to say that we should use this program to be able to pilot social ownership models. We agree. We think that one of the risks that we run as a country is that if we don't find ways to be able to spread the benefits of a renewables-based power system and the economy that underpins it, you're going to have these islands of wealthy people who have power and the rest who don't. And this is clearly an issue that is obviously of concern to the municipal sector as well. So social ownership, spreading the benefit, looking at partnerships, looking at how we use this as an opportunity to address energy poverty, but also to create a set of much broader vested interests in the energy system are things that we would like to achieve. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to dwell on this, both on the process and what is set out here in a fair amount of detail. So maybe just to say that we started doing the work on, we ran, in the process of putting the investment plan together, we ran a set of expert working groups. And when we had the electricity round table, the issue of municipal distribution came up as a serious gap in the work that we were doing. And so what we then did was to engage with, I think, a lot of the people who are already in this room, with Salgo, with a number of the organizations that are working in the sector. And we then did a piece of work to try and look at what we think municipal needs are. So the first category out of that is really the issue around the maintenance and to an extent the modernization of the municipal distribution infrastructure. That 200 billion rand amount is an estimate. And I think that one of the critical things that is going to need to be done going forward is to, I suppose, in a sense, ground truth and to do much more work so that that figure can be broken down and we understand what the different elements of it are. But at the moment, it's a global estimate, and it seemed to us from the experts in the field, there seemed to be broad consensus that we are looking at this major amount of around 200 billion that we would need to find if we are going to address the issues around maintenance and modernization of the distribution grid. We then put in an amount of 73 billion rand as an ask for really looking at what would need to be done to the grid if we were going to roll out electric vehicles at scale. And that's a 73 billion allocation. There's then an amount of 45 billion rand to support the electrification backlog. And I think Steve also spoke to it. You know, there are different ways. We're sitting with two things. Actually, quite a small proportion of the population that don't have access to electrical infrastructure is the way that I would put it at this point in time. But in reality, probably a much larger proportion of people, and particularly the poor and people in rural areas who might have connection but can't necessarily utilize that. We then put in a small allocation around demand side management. And I thought that the conversation earlier on around energy efficiency and the decline in municipal revenues is very interesting, because my question would be, to what extent has the increase in the price of electricity over the last 10 years driven users to in fact use power in a much more efficient way? And I suspect that with the kind of load shedding that we're seeing at the moment, that kind of gets a momentum. Then what we have looked at is an allocation around looking at design issues. And I think that a number of you have referred to it. If we are going to change the way that the grid works and the way that the grid is powered, there are significant design issues. We've put in quite a big allocation for really building the capability and capacity of municipalities to be able to run a different kind of distribution grid, including a small allocation for collective planning. And then to talk to the issues, a lot of what was raised in the questions earlier on, we acknowledge the issues and the complexities around the municipal revenue model that we operate on at the moment, and think that there's got to be quite significant work done around how we are going to put in place a viable system around municipal finances and finance management going forward. And I'm presuming that quite a lot of the conversation needs to be about, I would be very interested maybe to say how, you know, are these categories correct, and what is the work that would need to be done around them? And one of the things that we are starting to already do going forward is to look at what would be the terms of reference to take this work forward, and how would we need to work with municipalities around that. And we can come back to that later. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to race through the next few slides. This is really, given where we were in November last year, doing an estimate of what we might need in terms of the deployment of electric vehicles. I think the opportunity there for municipalities, in addition to those of you who have climate mitigation plans around the allocation for mobility emissions abatement, is really around what we see as a significant opportunity in for the electric vehicle sector to support the public transport sector. So in other words, to ensure that this isn't just a sector where you're getting very smart, very expensive passenger vehicles that are going to be driven by the wealthy. So there's a conversation that we need to be having there, and look at what that opportunity might be and how we can exploit it. Next slide. Okay, this I did speak to this a little bit earlier. It's about the green hydrogen sector, presuming the country decides we're really going to go for it. And I think the important thing about green hydrogen is you can't do a little bit of it. If you're going to do it, you've got to do the whole bit. So we've identified what would be needed in terms of doing project feasibilities in relation to a production of a whole set of green hydrogen products. We have put in an allocation for the capital costs of that, and then for the infrastructure that might be needed. Importantly, infrastructure, because the economics that have been done, the economic assessments of what it's going to take to develop the sector indicate that we would need to develop an export economy in green hydrogen in order to justify its utilization domestically. And where it is critical is that it's about the only way that we are going to be able to manage to keep our heavy industrial sector going into the future, including sectors like our steel, cement, and some of our intentions around beneficiating mining would also need new fuel sources, new and green fuel sources. And it's critical to the competitiveness of our country into the future. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, skills development. As I said, I think this allocation needs a lot of work, but we've got three categories at this point in time. The first is really around looking at the coordination that is needed, around particularly the plans that we need to develop as a country around the future of work and the new sectors that we would want to build in the skills requirement. We've then put in an allocation for pilot skills development zones in areas where we think there is either opportunity or risk. And then we put in an allocation to really look at how you then crowd in what is sitting in the fiscus and from business around skills in order that we can come up with a coherent plan. Next slide. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these principles, but I think it is important that in negotiating this 8.5 billion and in mobilizing the additional finance that we require as the country, the PCFTT did some important work around setting out a set of financing principles. And I think we can, I've spoken about the UNFCCC. We would want that finance to be additional to existing climate and development commitments. I'm not convinced that all of it is, but I think it's too early to tell. We need to reflect our country's unique needs. We want to mainstream the financing of the just transition components, including utilizing what is in the fiscus and looking at the way that we budget as a country to utilize our tax and other revenues. We are clear that when it comes to the loan finance part of this package, that the sovereign debt term should be more attractive than what we could get in the capital markets, that the finance flows should be predictable and certain, that the institutions best placed to manage the funds should have them allocated to them, that when it comes to partnerships with the private sector, there should be appropriate risk sharing. And I think that's a big conversation, what that means. And then lastly, that we've got to acknowledge the risk of corruption, and that we've got to put in place strong governance and strong safeguards so that that finance is used for the purposes intended in the most efficient way possible. Next slide. Okay. We've been talking about this 1.5 trillion offer. Now, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about what the 8.5 billion is made up. This slide sets out the IPG partners and the kinds of contributions that they are making. On the far left, the partners have committed 329.7 in grants, And as of this stage, not all, we are in a process with the IPG. We've asked those partners to set out exactly how those amounts, what is in those global amounts. And so there's a process of engagement underway. And I see the comments in the chat saying, how do we access the grants? I don't know at this point in time, but we are doing this analysis. And I think the most important thing that we are going to need to do is to say, what of this amount do we believe really talks very directly to this investment plan? And where are the unallocated funds and how should they best be deployed? So there is work to be done around the grant component. I should also add that since the investment plan was launched, and since we made it clear that as South Africa, we were very disappointed in the proportion of these funds that were grant finance, a number of these partners have come forward. The US has put another $45 million of grant finance on the table. Germany has put some significant additional grant finance on the table as well. And I think the others will. In addition, just to say that there are a number of other partners who now want to come to the party in relation to this finance. Then the bulk of this finance really is in concessional loans. National Treasury, particularly in the sovereign loans, has been engaging with these partners and negotiating. And the first two loans, 300 million euros from France and 300 million euros from the Germans, have been agreed with National Treasury and will flow into the fiscus. And Treasury's statement at the point that those loans were signed made it very clear that the terms were very attractive, at least 3% below what we could have acquired those loans at on the capital markets. There are then a 1.5 billion allocation for commercial loans coming from the UK and the United States. The US money will flow through DFC and goes to the private sector. The UK is busy engaging on how their BII finance will be used. There's then a 1.3 billion guarantee from the United Kingdom that is going to be granted to the African Development Bank. And the intention is that that is then used to leverage a much larger amount, and that is under discussion. So that really is how the $8.5 billion is made up. As I say, this is not pinned down neatly. There is a lot of engagement that still needs to happen, and negotiations that will need to happen, and National Treasury is central to a lot of the way that this finance will flow. Next slide. Okay, to talk about implementation. Firstly, the way that there's an interministerial committee that deals with climate and energy that provides the oversight, the high-level governance and the political coordination of this process, and that will remain in place. And then national government has obviously played a major role in this and will play an ongoing coordination role. There are then obviously institution-specific funding agreements between the providers of finance and the implementing institutions as the process moved. National Treasury will continue to manage sovereign loan agreements with providers of finance. We are then seeing a role for national intermediary institutions, for example, the DBSA and the IDC, to manage disbursements of capital from finance providers to municipalities, private companies, and to NGOs. And there needs to be a lot of work and discussion around how that would happen and where and how those funds would flow. We need to find a meaningful role for both trade union structures and for community level organization to play in relation to needs identification, the visibility of projects, the monitoring and evaluation, the way that these civil society and other organizations can support and have a role to play in the way that the program is rolled out and have ownership of the program. And then we need to, in terms of the way the private sector is going to be investing in renewable energy infrastructure, and in the other sectors, in the NEVs and the green hydrogen sector, we would want the private sector to agree to commit to reporting on the utilization of funds so that we're getting this global picture of how this program is operating. Next slide. I think we are pretty much at the end. Okay, so we want strong governance, we want robust management arrangements, we need a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework, and we have worked already on a risk management framework for the program. Next slide. I think that's the end. Okay, let me talk now for a few minutes around institutional arrangements and how the process is working. As you will be aware, the investment plan, the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team that was led by Daniel Manele, who has now stepped down and is chairing the Nedbank board, was responsible for, was the counterpart of the IPG in producing this plan. There was a secretariat that did the technical work around the plan, which I have been involved in together with Neil and my other colleagues on the line. And going forward, we are moving into an implementation phase that requires a different set of institutional arrangements. And in the interim, what has been agreed is that some of the people who are working for the PCFTT and some of the people who are working for the Secretariat will constitute a project management unit to be pulled together that will work in relation to the project management office in the presidency, also work quite closely in relation to NECOM, and that will continue to take forward the implementation work around this plan in consultation with the key social partners and stakeholders, including yourselves. There is a process as well of, in addition to the IMC, setting up a slightly broader than intergovernmental steering committee that would include not only the relevant national departments, but also the PCC, the IDC, the DBSA, possibly, I mean, I think we would need municipal involvement as well as key provincial government involvement. And that would then provide oversight in relation to the technical and implementation work that is going forward. So this is all at quite an early stage. These structures are just beginning to be set up, but that is the intention, that we do drive it. The last thing to say is that since the investment plan was launched, there is quite a number of potential new financiers who are coming, financiers and donors who have indicated that they would want to be part of the program. And I think that part of the art of this is going to be able to attract, and a large part of the work will be to look at how do we go forward and mobilize the financing gap between what we have on the table, including the private sector pipeline that will go into this and the 1.5 trillion rand. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Joanne. You speak about money with so much ease. Thank you for the good presentation. I see online we are joined by our Executive Director, Dr. Crispian. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Morning.
Thank you. You can still have a very good participation, about 77, 83, I think, depending on connectivity as well. We've taken the first item that was presented by Steve. We had very rich engagements, and we welcomed colleagues to send additional comments or questions to to Steve. We're going to engage on them as and when. Now we're engaging, getting a presentation on the Jade IP by Joanne, and she's doing extremely well. She's not scared of money like me. She speaks about dollars and rands interchangeably, which so much is, and we appreciate her for that. Now I'm going to hand over to Brian, but what I've noticed, Comrade Brian, is that the handle by Nomdeni Ngwenya, Nomdeni Ngwenya, posted something, but the signature there came from Silas Mlaudzi from Salga. So that's what I've noted. We may have called Nomdeni while Nomdeni is actually Silas. I want to hand over to you. You are going to take me to say 10 to 12, then please come back. Joanne, you will, as always, listen attentively and engage. I'm not sure Deepak is here. They will assist you. The colleagues that serves with you in that forum will assist you as well. Thank you very much, Comrade Brian. Over to you, my brother.
Yeah, thanks, Bongani. Thanks again to Joanne for that presentation. Again, now I open the floor for your comments and inputs to what Joanne has shared with us. Please raise your hand and I will recognize you. Whilst I'm waiting for the hands, I'm going to go to the chat and see the messages that have come through and invite people to speak from that. I'm going to start with Monique Griffith, City of Joburg. You talk about social ownership. You want to come in, Monique, and make your point, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. How are you? I think my question just revolves around Joanne's indication of presenting how a social ownership model will be incorporated into this. So I think my question was, how will that work? I mean, we know that a significant amount of our energy does escape the system from illegal connections. That has a bearing not only on revenue collection, but also revenue use, because that also wears down our predicted lifespan of equipment. So with the social ownership model is very interesting, because now you can potentially put these little off-grid solutions into townships, create a whole economic industry around it, and therefore be more likely to have the equipment protected and monitored. So I just wanted to get more information about that social ownership model. And then that is definitely somewhere where the municipalities should be coming into play. And it completely feeds into our smart city strategy as City of Johannesburg. So I was just interested in more information there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before going to Joanne, I just want to check if Silas Mlaudzi, you are there. Silas, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks. I can hear you, Chair.
Please come in and make your input.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Yes, and sorry, I had a challenge with my link, then I had to use the one that we received from Nomdeni. My question or input is about the need for upgrade as well as maintenance of the municipal distribution network, which the backlog is quite known, and we appreciate the investment needs of 200 billion from the local government. We believe that it will help, but especially in a situation where there is a lot of increase rather in the installation of embedded generation, which we're all aware that as customers were encouraged, especially with the tax incentives that was actually spoken to last week. So I understand this is an estimate. Wanted to check, Joanne. I think the regulator has got the backlog, municipal infrastructure maintenance backlog. Was that considered in terms of arriving at this particular estimate of 200 billion or not? That's what I want to know, one. And secondly, of course, it's a difficult question to answer, as you said, Joanne, but there are many municipalities that are starting to plan to, develop the jet-related projects, in which case our distribution network becomes one of them. And of course, there is a need to have those in the municipal IDP. So my question is around the timelines, Joanne. I know you may not have the specific answer for this, but approximate timelines around the finalization of this investment needs and the disbursement. That's what we want to know from the local government. Thank you.
Thanks, Cyrus. Joanne, you want to take those first two inputs, please?
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe let me make two preliminary points, which I think apply to both. The first really is to emphasize the fact that this 1.48 trillion is an ask. There is a significant financing gap beyond the $8.5 billion and what the private sector can contribute to this. And I mean, there is a significant private sector pipeline that is available for investment in this program. I think that we are sitting in a bit of a sort of chicken and egg situation as a country, because I think that part of the work that we are going to need to do is to develop the programs and projects that would enable us to secure the additional finance. And I think I would certainly hope that some of the grant finance component could be used for that, because our sense is that with good projects and with good programs, there are a whole host of financiers and donors who would be willing to invest in this. But if we don't have them, you kind of sit talking about what you want, but you can't say this is the form that it would take. So I think there is quite a big conversation to be held in terms of implementation about an approach to project identification, project feasibility, project preparation, and how we could do that as sectors and as a country in the most efficient way possible. And I think it would apply to the social ownership issues as well. I think we've said that we think that there needs to be finance made available for pilot projects. The PCC is doing some work around this, and I wonder whether Dr. Olver or one of his team could come in and talk about the work that they are looking at. There are, for example, some interesting things that Eskom has done in terms of rolling out its mini grids to township and communities in the Eastern Free State with some fairly good outcomes. There are a couple of other small projects that we know of, but we're going to need to do the work around it. And I would see this as work that we should be doing and could be doing with a whole set of civil society organizations and with the unions. I think, so just to clarify that, Silas, so I can't be clear on the timeframes. I think it is to the extent, I mean, some of this $8.5 billion is not allocated yet. It's not pinned down. There is work to be done between National Treasury and the financiers. So I think the sooner we can get to the point where we know what is needed, where we have some concrete plans in place, the sooner we can start to look at some real financial mobilization around this. I am also hoping, and I think part of the intention is that this plan also influences particularly the capital investments that are provided for in the fiscus, and will then guide further investment into this. I see that Deepak's hand is up, Brian.
Yes, Deepak, please come.
Thank you very much, Brian. I don't see other hands up, so I thought I would also just put in a few words. I think the point that Joanne has made is very, very important because a number of...
Sorry, Deepak, can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Deepak Patel, and I head up the climate finance and innovation portfolio in the Secretariat of the PCC. I think Joanne's first point needs to be understood very, very well, because there are a number of questions, for example, in the Q&A and the chat related to how do municipalities apply for this financing. I think we must differentiate between the 8.5 billion offered by the IPG and then look at what the ask or the quantification, for want of a better word, the JET IP assumes will be the required financing for the three sectors that are enunciated in the JET IP. And Joanne has made a very, very important point, and that is, this is not available finance. This is finance that we as a country, through our governmental partnership, through our regulatory processes, and through changes in our policy environment, need to be attracted, mobilized, and then hopefully scaled up to achieve the 1.4 trillion rand that is estimated to be the needs in the JET IP. So that's a very important point to make. And this journey is going to be a long journey, although the JET IP envisages a set of projects, some granularly expressed, some still to be developed, that we need to forge this partnership. And we also know that a large portion of this is going to flow not just to the national grid infrastructure, but also to deal with issues related to municipal well-being of both the distribution as well as, in this case, the micro and smart grids that need to be brought into existence. So in this context, the PCC wants to ensure that social ownership, to the point made by one of the commentators earlier, is explored as an avenue through which not only more electrons can be brought onto municipal local grids, but also to ensure that the just transition components with respect to social economic development also come side by side with these projects. The issue raised with respect to security, safety and security, as well as vandalism and theft, the PCC has also acknowledged that these are serious issues and we need to pay attention to these issues. With respect to municipal finance, budgeting, billing systems, the scope for public-private partnerships in the context of both the PFMA and the MFMA are issues that we as the PCC want to unfold in the form of pilot projects, as well as studies into how we can make this feasible. And arising out of this consultation, the PCC wants to commit that we will work with local government partners, either collectively or municipality by municipality, to begin to develop solutions to these seemingly intractable problems of revenue versus investment, the reliance on revenues from electricity for municipal budgets, as well as some of the technical issues or technology issues that have been raised. So I just wanted to make those few points. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thanks, Deepak. I do not see any more hands.
Okay. Brian, can I just respond on the question around wind versus solar?
Please go on.
Okay, and it's something that I should have said at the beginning. If you want to look at the detail of the investment plan, it is on the presidency website. There's also been circulation of documents to you all. But the way that this investment plan is written is that there is an executive summary at the front. Then there's about 100 pages, which deals with the detail of what has been presented here. And then there is a set of annexures that set out in very granular detail the methodology, the assumptions, the way that the costing was derived around all of the proposals that have been made in the investment plan. The allocations for wind and for solar really built on what is in the IRP, as well as some of Eskom's, some engagements with Eskom. And in the costing itself, wind is actually more expensive to install than solar is. So the kind of costing, the imbalancing costing doesn't necessarily refer to quantum, but it refers to what it would cost to build that installed capacity. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I note that Dr. Oliver wants to come in. Please come in, Dr. Oliver.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just picking up on the issue of alternative ownership models. Joanne mentioned that we were doing some work. And just to say, I mean, this is an issue that's come up in almost all of the consultations. And certainly Labour and civil society and local government have quite consistently said that we don't want the future energy system simply to be, you know, a wholesale privatization. We would like to see some alternatives, and some of that is public sector. There obviously are limitations on Eskom's balance sheet, but municipalities now have the power to do own generation, and I think that's an opportunity that we need to seize, you know, wholeheartedly. And as the Commission, we, you know, are ready to, you know, swing in and provide support to municipalities that do want to branch out and do their own kinds of generation models. And then we're very interested in exploring, you know, worker and community-owned models. And you know, obviously, just to note, you know, REAP already has quite a strong community ownership element. You know, it's part of the criteria for the REAP bidding process. There are a couple of really exciting projects, including one in Kwazakele in Gqeberha, where, you know, community ownership of large-scale renewable projects servicing that community have been piloted. So the work that we're doing as the Commission, it's sort of in parallel. There's this component in the JET IP, which I think is really exciting, and it's proposing to fund 2 or 3 pilot projects to move forward. What we're doing as the PCC, we've gone out and tender. We're about to appoint an academic institution which is going to scope the issue, you know, go through all the literature, both globally and internationally, look at the best practice examples that, you know, we can learn from and model, and then, you know, go through a process of identifying and supporting a couple of pilot projects to get going. You know, bear in mind, this is an area, I mean, there's some instances, I mentioned the REAP program, where you've already got a whole lot of stakes by communities in these renewable projects. There's also considerable worker pension fund money, and, you know, they're making investment decisions all the time. One of the sectors they're wanting to move into in a major way, obviously, is the whole, you know, clean tech, renewable energy sector. So it's something that doesn't just have to be, you know, like a marginal nice to have on the corner. I mean, this could be a mainstream, serious, large set of alternative ownership models in the renewable sector. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Oliver, for that input. I do not see any hands, colleagues. Please raise your hands to make your input. I note that Megan Houston Brown, you were making a comment in the chat. You want to come in and make that input?
Thanks, Brian. So I think it's really exciting what Crispian's referring to now, and the sort of detailed study, and they're pulling together bits and pieces. It is a very complex area. And one of the things that we sort of have noted is that municipalities, in a sense, they are designed to be the sort of legitimate representatives of people who are not, or where, particularly where people don't have access to capital. Municipalities are the people who therefore invest in the infrastructure and then deliver the services as efficiently as possible. And it's certainly the whole municipal systems is designed for that. And it's sort of, so this whole raising of the need to sort of see community ownership models, which I think is critical, but I think we've got to do them skillfully. Because municipalities are actually best placed to provide the cheapest services to people. So I think we just need to be skillful about where we make the investments and where we find the places to transfer wealth, because that's fundamentally what you're wanting to look at. So I think the explorations and discussions are really, really critical. The answers aren't always that easy, and they're not all, put it this way, the sort of just putting systems on people's roofs is probably not the best investment, but there will be lots of other ways to transfer wealth. And maybe one I just wanted to raise is not to forget the new electric vehicle sector as well. So with charging stations at a municipal level, you know, there are going to be quite a few big investors because there's a lot of private money that needs to get put into charging stations, public charging stations. But it's really an opportunity for municipalities to maybe put a requirement on those private investors to create franchise systems and build skills, and also to make sure that those charging stations are put into the areas where mass transit has access to them. So just not to forget the electric vehicle side as well, in terms of the wealth transfer and the new businesses being created there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that input. It's not a question. I think it's an input, Joanne. So yes, you can come in, Joanne.
I want to just agree on the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And in the consultation that we held, what was very interesting was the engagement with the people who have taken at risk, who at risk are starting to invest in the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And according to them, kind of basically, if we doubled the numbers of electric vehicles that are circulating, particularly in metros, there's a very strong business case to sustain quite a diversified set of livelihoods. So I would agree that that is a major opportunity for building SMEs and looking at the potential for entrepreneurs and others to be able to invest. I also do think that this in the medium term is a major opportunity for the taxi industry as well.
Thanks, Joanne. Megan, do you want to come back, or is that an old?
Can I quickly come in? And Brian, I promise I won't be long, but just to say, I think the other area that's often neglected, and localized studies at the metro level show that the greatest amount of jobs will actually be in the built environment. So I just think we must explore that more deeply and exactly what it means. Some of it is embedded generation implementation, but a lot of it is also around efficiency, built environment, fabric, and it's really a space where most jobs apparently in the metros will be created. The 4 big metros have got net zero carbon policies that need sort of scaling up, but once those start taking effect, I think there's huge scope, and I think that scope can really move into the low income environment as well. So I absolutely not just high-end buildings also. Thanks.
Thanks. No, thanks. Thanks for that contribution. Colleagues, I'm looking for more inputs. We still have a bit of time that we can make the most of. Yes, Paul, please come in.
Thanks, Chair. Jan, I see in your budget you had a very small amount for DSM. And I think that we need to actually boost quite a lot. You know, we've just heard Megan mention the issue of electric vehicle charging. And one of the issues of the studies we've done with Megan and Sustainable Energy Africa was that you should not allow dumb charging. And what we mean by that is that you need to put demand side equipment or systems in place for electric vehicle charging at homes or on the distribution network. Otherwise, you're going to end up having overload problems. I think that was the most important thing of that study, was not to allow dumb charging. But I think in general, the DSM side of things is just as important, and we should be spending a lot more money on that for either dynamic time of use tariffs, to implement time of use tariffs so that we can flatten that evening peak. And to do that, we need to make those investments. And also, of course, once you've got demand side facilities on your network, it makes managing that network much easier, particularly if you've got a network that's suffering from capacity constraints. And while also, I know Joanne also mentioned energy storage or battery storage systems, but probably the most powerful tool that we're going to have going forward in terms of DSM is embedded battery sites, if I can put it that, embedded energy storage sites. So it's going to be quite important how we integrate certainly energy storage into the network, and very much that demand side management aspect of energy storage. I would start to think we need to make a much bigger investment there. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Joanne?
Thank you. I think that was a very useful intervention, and I would agree. You know, kind of in another life, I ran a very big private sector energy efficiency program, and on average, across all sizes of enterprises, putting in place some quite cheap interventions could result in up to 40% saving in relation to energy usage. So I think it is a huge opportunity, and I think the question, and maybe it's a kind of broader comment, is that we need to start to work on what are the projects and programs that we want to invest in relation to this plan, and I think municipalities and municipal proposals around this are quite critical if we are going to drive this program forward, to firstly to secure the finance and then into implementation. But I do agree that DSM is a low-hanging fruit that we in South Africa have not utilized properly. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanne. Any further comments, colleagues? Any further questions or comments for Joanne? Just want to check with you, Joanne, when you talk about the next phase as implementation, what does that really mean?
Okay, so I think that there are, at the moment, firstly, just to say that we are trying to, doing the work to put together an implementation plan that says, here's what the investment plan says, here's what is already happening, here's what we would want to do going forward, and this is the work and the actions that are needed for that. So maybe to give you a sense, part of it in relation to this conversation is to do the further work that we discussed around the municipal sector. So and thank you, Silas, and I think was it Silas who raised the issue of the NERSA information. But it is to be able to do a few more studies and collective pieces of work with particular stakeholders around gap areas or areas where, in order to start to build programs and projects, you're going to need more information. I think the second, so that's the one piece of work. The second piece of work is a piece of work around concluding the negotiation of the existing commitments in relation to the $8.5 billion. That is work, a large part of which will be done with National Treasury, but with others as well. The third thing that is happening at the moment is, as I said in the beginning, is the analysis of this grant component of the program to understand how much of this is finance that has been allocated, how much of it is available, where could it be going, and then how could we ensure that those funds flow into particular projects and programs. And I think that we hope to have that process concluded by the middle of April. We are in a process with the IPG around that. And then I think that we have to get onto the very big things. So ensuring that we both raise the finance and deploy the finance into the transmission grid, ensure that this work that has been done or what we are proposing around municipal distribution kind of takes form. I think that that is going to require a lot of work to be done and a lot of support to be given around project development and project development, so that there is a kind of almost a country portfolio of fundable activities. I think is one of the important things that I would see coming out of an ongoing engagement with the municipal sector, because I think there is a lot of interest in financing these municipal investments. And then I think that for the other sections of the IP, a similar kind of process as well. And then I think we have to look at private sector leveraging and get both that appropriate risk sharing that I spoke about, as well as ensuring that the private sector funds flow in ways that are aligned to where big projects and programs are happening at a governmental level, that we're getting that leveraging to happen in a way that is in the interest of all. So I think, yeah, a lot of work to be done. And I think it would be important that once that implementation plan has been finalized and signed off, that it is also then made available. But I think we have a problem as a country in that we know what we want to do, but have we done the work that allows us to go out and attract the finance? And often we haven't. And so for me, supporting that process will be a very important outcome of the investment plan in the next year or two.
No, thanks, Joanne.
I'm not certain if Neil, sorry, Brian, I'm wondering if Neil wants to add anything.
Neil, are you there? Can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I can. I mean, I think just the further work that is going to be needed in figuring out the financial flows is an important area. But at the same time, to say that, I mean, this plan does not find a blank slate, right? I mean, we do have the Public Finance Management Act in place. We do have an Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act in place. There's a mechanism of conditional grants and equitable share. We have a very advanced program-based budgeting system in place that has corresponding programs at national, provincial, and local government level. And lots of those mechanisms will be used. And this financing certainly will also point out some gaps in the existing systems and provide opportunities to reform, so that we, put in place also systems that are fit for purpose for the way that these funds are going to flow. Thanks.
No, thanks, Neil. Chair, I do not see any hands nor any further comments on the chat. I take it that the colleagues will engage with the documents that are being shared. And I'm now handing over to you for the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Brian. I think Joanne's presentation is so detailed to an extent that people do not have questions. So it answers questions that will come from the floor. I really appreciated the interaction and the comments from the various colleagues. Like I said, you're welcome, colleagues, to interact with us continuously. There's one. All right, I think it's answered from Lautzi, Silas. All right, as a way forward, I'm not sure, Clive, do you want to come before me, before I wrap up? From the Secretariat point of view. Dr. Olive, is he still here? I see went to 62. Deepak, what have you done? Went to 62.
No,
Deepak has been removing people, executive director.
You think Deepak's been throwing them off the webinar? So, Chair, just, I mean, from my side, just to thank you and Brian for so ably facilitating this discussion, and to thank our presenters. I mean, as you can see, there's an enormous amount of work that's gone into both the energy transition recommendations and this JET IP. And, you know, many of the people that have done the hard work in pulling that together have been here on the call today. And then, you know, to all of you who are at the coalface in local government, I mean, this is really about you. You're the ones that are really doing the hard work of, you know, navigating a really complex and difficult energy transition and energy crisis. So, you know, we ultimately, our objective is to empower you to do your jobs. And, you know, just from my side, from the Climate Commission, and I know from the broader presidency team and the JET IP team, you know, you need to understand we are committed to delivering on this transition and to getting local government to play an active role on a whole range of areas that fall within your constitutional responsibilities. So thank you for taking time. We look forward to the substantive engagement. I've now forgotten the date, but maybe Deepak or Steve can remind us of what the date for the follow-up meeting is. And the follow-up meeting will be hybrid. So it's going to have both an in-person and an online component. And we'll hopefully try and, Steve says it's on the 14th of March. Great, thanks for that, Steve. So yeah, thank you everyone for your time and for participating.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Doc, and much appreciated your input. We are going to share with the colleagues, Mansansa, if you may, before they step out of the meeting, share our calendar, which takes us to the 29th of March, the National Conference Colloquium, as you may want to call it. We still have a number of engagements, and I think colleagues are more than welcome to join and interact with us. Notably, there's a conference on the youth and just transition opportunities that we are going to have, and you'll understand that the country is youthful with a very young population, and whatever we do, we are mindful of the future. Yes, we do have the principles, the three principles, which is your distributive, restorative, and procedural justice. This is about the people at the center of just transition, as it were. And you are correct, Doc, that local government is at the cold face of the difficulties we're facing. I would appeal to municipalities as I close to continue to review their capacity to respond to the adverse events and strengthen their disaster management programs, because we can see that we're living in difficult times and we need to really strengthen our programs to assist. I'm not going to talk about issues of spatial planning, the importance of as well, that we must continue to raise awareness with our people to avoid the low lying areas, especially those that are wet, even if they are not wet, but we must just raise awareness with our people. Focus shall be, of course, on the review of your fiscal framework and the alternative revenue streams, as it were. But we are going to take whatever inputs you are going to give us and that you've given us online and that you are going to give us through the other processes or platforms. This shall culminate into the final report. But in closing, thank you very much to everyone, the honorable councillors that came here to attend, the colleagues from various groups, and thank you very much, Dr. Olive, for leading a team that is so capable, passionate about the subject. They are always available to interact with us as commissioners, and I want to believe that they are also available to interact with stakeholders from time to time, and that speaks to your leadership. And we stand here in the huge boots of our the deputy chair of the commission, Ubabu Vali Musa, who shares the commission on behalf of the president as well. With that said, colleagues, thank you very much for coming. See you next time. I will officially adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mwale. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.